Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and this video I'd like to discuss, not for the first time, the views of an important cross-party select committee of MPs who couldn't believe that the Conservative government had carried out planning exercises for what to do in the event of a likely pandemic, but gave absolutely zero consideration to economic matters. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, when in 2016 the government, which included Boris Johnson in a senior role, were carrying out Operation Cygnus, which was a series of exercises designed to wargame what would happen in the event of a viral pandemic. This was carried out because for years the government had recognised that such an event was the #1 threat to the nation. We knew one was coming, and this was the opportunity to prepare. Of course, very few of the recommendations were ever actioned, hence what happened. This was a previous group of people in the Conservative government, because obviously a lot of the senior ministerial positions are occupied by different people now, doesn't absolve the current crop, because the now Prime Minister Boris Johnson was involved at the time, and the now Health Secretary Matt Hancock, although not the Health Secretary when the exercises were taking place, was the Health Secretary when the recommendations were supposed to be being implemented. So the responsibility for failing to prepare in the way that Operation Cygnus suggested is tied very firmly to both Johnson and Hancock. However, the Public Accounts Committee, which is a group of MPs that I've already discussed this week and contains a majority of Conservative MPs, so their statements are not party political against the Conservatives, couldn't believe that at no point had we actually carried out any exercises to assess the impact on the economy and what planning we should do to prepare for that. No equivalent of Operation Cygnus had taken place for economic matters. The Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy didn't even know Operation Cygnus was going on. Had no idea. Completely excluded. And this actually is genuinely surprising. Now, one feature of this government in recent years is just how often select committees of MPs, which represent different parties, including the government party, keep saying that they cannot believe the government have been so reckless in doing A or B or not doing C or D. There are times when I have to just question their surprise. Are you really surprised? Do you not know how useless these chances are, I sometimes have to say? But this one actually does surprise me, because if there's one thing the Conservatives do think about, it's the economy. That thinking never leads them to doing the right thing, of course. They bugger up the economy every time they're given an opportunity, but they do at least think about it. You know, Boris Johnson's attitude towards coronavirus, for example, and goodness knows he's not exactly a thinking Prime Minister, has been to prioritise the economy over everything else. Whenever they talk about any measures, it's always the economy that they're talking about protecting. And this will end in the same sort of track record that Conservatives are famous for. Actually not famous because they're really good at covering up and distracting the public from what they're doing. But the COVID policies will nonetheless actually knacker our economy because of their ham-fisted attempts, ironically, to save it whilst ignoring advice from actual economists. But surprising or not, there was no economic planning exercises for the #1 threat to the nation. But you may interject, our economic performance has been much better than our, say, healthcare performance during this pandemic. Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the Treasury was certainly on it fairly quickly. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced a series of measures that avoided much greater economic harm than would otherwise have been the case. It wasn't completely without criticism because there were a lot of holes in it through which a lot of people fell through. But still, the general idea was good and received cross-party support. And I did a video a little while ago about how this was made possible. Not because of Rishi Sunak's brilliance, but because senior civil servants in the Treasury worked with the Bank of England together on a plan well before the government were taking the pandemic seriously. They saw the threat immediately. And This was only possible because Dominic Cummings had not yet axed the senior members of the Treasury Department in the same way that he had in other government departments. There are virtually no senior experienced civil servants left in those senior positions in most government departments now. But the Treasury did, so they still had competent experts at the helm. So yes, in that sense, our economic performance was better because they were able to say to the Chancellor, look, we've been working on this, here's what we can do. And it looked like he was able to come up with something very, very quickly. But I would say, although, you know, the Treasury did well from that point of view, comparing it to our healthcare response is comparing it to a very, very low bar indeed. However, economic forecasts are still suggesting that we are going to be hit more than comparable countries that, well, took what Conservatives consider to be harsher measures in dealing with the pandemic. So if they're saying that they are carrying out certain actions or avoiding certain actions to save the economy, and yet we're taking a bigger economic hit than countries that have done what these people have said they shouldn't do. In addition, there is no economic plan for autumn. This is absolutely crucial. The furlough scheme that projected a lot of jobs is being wound down from today. Now, part of that process is that right now, employers are expected to pay some of the furloughed wages as the government scales their contribution down in a phased reduction of support. So the situation was, if you are a worker that cannot be productive for your company, you can be furloughed, which means you're basically at home, you're not doing anything, but you're still retained. You will be paid 80% of your wages. That has been covered by the government. Now, what employers are expected to do is to cover 20% of the wages, and the government will cover the other 60%, and it's going to be phased out. Now, you can agree or not with the principle of the government phasing it out, but this is a matter of economic reality rather than political principle, because as a direct result of that policy, thousands of furloughed workers are now already receiving letters telling them that they will not now be retained. Because it was one thing for a company to retain staff if it wasn't really costing them any wages. It meant their HR department had to do some paperwork, but it wasn't really costing them as such. But it is now another thing that these companies have to pay something. Even though it's only a fifth of the wages, it's still something for workers that are not bringing anything in for that company. Now, there will be at least 3 reasonable explanations for that, beyond profiteering. I'm not talking about that. 3 reasonable excuses. Most businesses are small, and I mean the vast majority. A small business employing 1 or 2 staff cannot afford to shell out for workers that are not productive. After all, if their staff are furloughed still at this point, then that means their business is not really, in any serious sense, economically active. In other words, money's not really coming in. So, you know, most businesses don't have a load of reserves to cover for a rainy day like this, like paying workers to sit at home. Business loans have been made available by the government, but again, an awful lot of these businesses that don't have those reserves are looking at it thinking, well, I don't know when I'm going to... If they can't at the moment scale their business back up, they don't necessarily know when they can. Even when they can, if they can, will they be able to pay off that loan? Will that just make their business financially unviable with the government loan? So a lot of them are looking at it as, well, it might be better to cut our losses. They may never be able to pay it off. And then they can just be saddled with not only still losing their business, but, you know, a load of government debt. Then you have the case of the business that used this time to reevaluate their staffing. You know, obviously, we're in a changing situation now. In fact, I think there's a lot of people, you know, getting stressed out because they're wondering when we're going to return to normality. I get it. I think at some point we will. Don't get me wrong. There are certain ways that we should never go back to. There are certain things we shouldn't go back to. But, you know, if we wanted to, normality will return at some point. But it's not likely to for any time soon. My mindset is very much of thinking of, this is the situation. It's going to be the situation for a while. How do I adapt to this? Sorry if you can hear dogs barking. It's a bit of thunder and lightning upsetting them. And so, obviously, employers are doing this as well. Businesses are doing this. They're reevaluating the way they do things. As part of that, they'll be reevaluating their staffing needs. It may well be that they come out with the conclusion, we don't actually need this many staff. So, you know, again, happy to keep them on furlough while it wasn't costing them anything. Now that it's costing them something. Finally, there are businesses who might employ unskilled workers, don't really require much training, like an hour's training to do the job. And they feel that they can let staff go while they're not needed and then just rehire them when they do. Again, if training is minimal and massive unemployment means, you know, because of this crisis, that they're going to have a ready stock of potential employees whenever they like. So they're not going to struggle when they need those extra staff to get them hired very, very quickly. And that's the reality. That is the reality of this government policy. Again, whether you agree with the principle or not. And if the furlough scheme was designed to stop unemployment getting completely out of hand, what is their plan when autumn sees the rate of infection soaring high again and businesses struggling due to one of two reasons? One, local lockdowns, national lockdowns, whatever it happens to be that says your business has to go back into hibernation. Or two, even if your business is allowed to trade, but you've got workers having to ring in saying they've got to isolate now because they've been told they've been in contact with someone with COVID, or they've become ill themselves with COVID, or indeed anything. That business is going to struggle. It's going to struggle. So, although the Treasury came out of the first wave of COVID with some credit, the thinking now is as muddled and ineffective as many other departments because there isn't any. The Treasury are not saying what they intend to do for this autumn. They've not come out with anything new. How much easier would their task have been if the government, a few years ago, had actually simulated the economic impact of the pandemic when they were simulating the impact on people's health in 2016? Because then, a few years later, when they had the least talented ministers the party has ever had in government, they might have actually had a handbook for what to do. I mean, sure enough, they may not have followed through on the recommendations. They certainly didn't for Cygnus. But they would have at least had them now to hand and maybe could have looked at them and gone, actually, that we could implement this now, belatedly. It may not be as effective, but it would be better than nothing. And who knows, maybe they would have put some of them in place. But there we go. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.